Koolhaas's prompt of 1914 to 2014 sits really well with the Uncommon Earth project because it's a pair of memorials that commemorate the 1914, 1918 World War I and then World War II. So there's an obvious synergy there between the work and Koolhaas's prompt. But I think in other ways it challenges perhaps Koolhaas's notion that globalisation, which he sees as starting with 1914 and World War I, that it sits somewhat awkwardly in the idea that there is a global architecture, because I see some quite strong aspects in the Mulloway Studio project that are about regionalism. They're not necessarily visually obvious, but they're more to do with the idea of process and the fact that the making of this pair of memorials is highly located in its space, in the space of Canberra, itself a very regionally inflected project, and in the idea that architecture is not so much about object but can be about process and event. And perhaps there I'm thinking about Shumi's idea that architecture is made of event, space and movement. Because the fascinating thing about Uncommon Earth is that it's made from the earth of all the townships in Australia that delivered up their young men and women to the world wars. And that's a very profound way of gathering a community 100 years on to think about death and nationhood and all the things that memorials traditionally do in architectural formal terms. Australian architecture likes to mythologise its relationship to land. I'm not certain how accurate that is for the bulk of architectural projects that are being built in Australia, but certainly Uncommon Earth makes a very strong connection to the idea of place and the actual physical thing of soil, the idea of soil as homeland, the soil that the fighting services left behind, particularly in World War I, to fight on foreign soil. And in that kind of connection to the national identity of home and soil and place and land, there's also an implicit reference to Indigenous Australia and the importance of that ground. Memorials are often put, well, they're generally put on what's called common ground, so it's not land which belongs to a denomination or a religious affiliation for purposes of inclusivity. And yet these two memorial towers sit on land which belonged to the first Australians or was in the caretaking of the first Australians. So it is in many ways about a reconciliation with that. Although there's not explicit reference to it in the memorial, I know that was in the minds of the designers how this place could be a reconciliation between ordinary people in Australia, the idea of a capital and the sort of trauma of two world wars. Plus there's also the trauma that sits in the middle of those two world wars, which was profound for Australia, and that's the Great Depression. And I think the spacing of these two monuments either side of the land axis of Canberra, the vistas to the natural topography, the artificial lake, all those things bring into tension, I guess, some tensions that exist in Australian architecture, our right to be here, how we relate to the land, how we assimilate our attitudes to place and building in an ancient nation that has a very different history of those things. It's such a shame to me that firstly this project didn't win the competition, I think it was second, but also that the first prize winner in the competition for the memorials wasn't built, because I would have liked to have seen that, and compare it with the Mulloway Studio entry. But the design itself, I think, would have offered up a very profound experience to people who visited it. The use of very compressed spaces in the two towers, one which plunges into the earth and the other, which shapes a kind of window to the heavens, would make dramatically different experiences of enclosure. And it's not always the case that monuments do have enclosure. They can be more sculptural, I guess, than architectural. So I think how that set up shelter and a close claustrophobic space would have been really wonderful to feel the still, the calm, the quiet, and all the other non-visual aspects of architecture, which I think are fundamental. Those memorials would have smelt amazing, made from rammed earth. They would feel damp. The sound would be muffled, and the lining of the entry rampways into those places in metal would have made a really dissonant and clanging sound that would recall, I imagine, some of the aspects of warfare and our relationship to machines in those terrible times. I think that it would have been wonderful to see how those places changed through night and day, and the interior spaces lit up in the middle of a hot Canberra day with tiny pinpoints of light would have been beautiful, and these things operating as little lanterns on the side of the lake. A really redemptive act in architecture, coming out of such shameful, I guess, global experiences. I think that there are obvious parallels in the design that relate it to both kind of empire architecture, the classical or neoclassical forms that are obvious in Canberra and any capital of Australia. But there's also a very strong modernist quality to the sort of pure and clear, clean lines of these monoliths, or I suppose if there's two of them, they're duoliths, I guess. Also, they remind me of Peter Zumthor's chapel, the name of which I can't pronounce. But a very similar kind of making, very similar kind of deep space. And I think that's an interesting reflection in itself. Yes, there is a quality of global infusion there, which is a respectful and interesting idea. Perhaps Coolhouse is right in thinking that modernity has led to a globalisation, and maybe that's not a bad thing, because those two spaces, Zumthor's Chapel and the Mulloway Studio Unbuilt project, strike me as moving towards a really accessible phenomenological experience of space, one which touches at the heart of our kind of human condition and the beauty and the possibilities for architecture.